Hello. And welcome back to Film History MOOC Teaching Video 5. Let's enjoy some historical knowledge on film. Hello. And welcome back to the third part of this topic. Enjoy. The most prolific and successful directors of the movement were able to start their own companies. After his early successes for Path, Gans formed Films Abel Gans in 1919, though it did not become financially independent of Path until 1924. After a disagreement with Gaumont over Don Juan et Faust in 1923, L'Herbier formed Cinegraphic. This firm produced most of L'Herbier's subsequent 1920s work and also financed Deluxe L'Inondation and two Impressionist films directed by one of L'Herbier's main actors, Jacques Catelan. Epstein formed Les Films Jean Epstein in 1926 and kept it going for 2 years, during which time he made some of the Impressionist movement's most daring films. Such independent production fostered the Impressionist movement. As we shall see, after the filmmakers lost their small companies in quick succession, the movement faded. Impressionist theory. The style of the Impressionist movement derived partly from the directors' beliefs about the cinema as an art form. They expressed these beliefs in poetic, often abstruse, essays and manifestos, which helped define them as a distinct group. The Impressionists saw art as a form of expression, conveying the personal vision of the artist. Art creates an experience, and that experience leads to emotions for the spectator. Art creates these feelings not by making direct statements but by evoking or suggesting them. In short, artworks create fleeting feelings, or impressions. By the 1920s, this view of art was a bit old-fashioned, being rooted in 19th-century Romantic and Symbolist aesthetics. Cinema and the other arts. Sometimes Impressionist theorists claimed that the cinema is a synthesis of the other arts. It creates spatial relationships, as architecture, painting, and sculpture do. Because cinema is also a temporal art, however, it combines its spatial qualities with rhythmic relationships comparable to those of music, poetry, and dance. On the other hand, Impressionist theorists also treated the cinema as a pure medium, presenting unique possibilities to the artist. This claim led some filmmakers to advocate making only cinema per pure cinema, abstract films that concentrated on graphic and temporal form, often with no narrative. Most Impressionists took a less radical course, making narrative films that explored the medium of cinema. Formal traits of Impressionism. These assumptions about the nature of cinema had a considerably impact on the Impressionist film style and narrative structure. Most important, filmic techniques often function to convey character subject activity. This subject activity includes mental images, such as visions, dreams or memories, optical point of view POV shots, and characters' perceptions of events rendered without POV shots. While it is true that films in all countries had used such devices as superimpositions and flashbacks to show characters' thoughts or feelings, the Impressionists went much further in this direction. The end of French Impressionism. Of the three European movements that overlapped during the 1920s, French Impressionism lasted the longest, from 1918 to early 1929. Late in the decade, several factors contributed to its decline. As the movement became better established, the interests of its filmmakers became more diverse. In addition, significant changes within the French film industry made it more difficult for some of them to retain control over their own work. The introduction of sound. The international adoption of sound. Synchronized sound movies were invented in just a few countries, but they soon became an international phenomenon. 3 other countries produced important sound films in the early years. At the same time, language barriers were surmounted through dubbing, subtitles, and so on, so that dialogue films could circulate around the world. During the silent era, Léon Gaumont had persistently tried to devise a French sound system. In October 1928, Gaumont presented a program of sound shorts and a feature with post-dubbed songs. Like the Warner Brothers, he wanted to replace the live music and other entertainment that typically accompanied silent films. The early sound market in France, however, was dominated by American and German systems. Also in October, Paramount wired its first-run Paris theater and showed a short film starring the French music hall star Maurice Chevalier. Other successful screenings, such as The Jazz Singer in January 1929, led to a race by French producers to make sound features. Since French studios were still being wired, the earliest, largely undistinguished, films were produced in London, including the first French sound feature, Les Trois Masques, The Three Masks, 1929, and in Berlin E.g. L'amour chanté, Singing Love, 1930. Since France was an important market, German interests sought to capture part of the production sector. In early 1929, Tobey's Klangfilm set up a subsidiary, the Société Française de Films Sonores Tobey's, in Paris. Tobey's produced many major French films, including the highly influential first 3 sound features of René Clair, which we shall discuss shortly. Uncertainty concerning sound led to a dip in French production. By 1930, however, most of the main studio buildings were wired, using either American or German systems or one of several minor French brands. Wiring went on until 1934, since many theaters were small and independently owned. Despite the weakness of the French film industry during this period, several filmmakers experimented with the new technique. La Petite Lisa, Little Lisa, 1930, Jean Gramillon tells a simple, melodramatic story of Berthier, a convicted murderer released after a long term in a South American prison. He returns to Paris to find his fragile daughter, Lisa, who has secretly become a prostitute. Gramillon shot some scenes in the studio with synchronized dialogue, but he achieved variety by filming others silent, adding sound later. For example, in the opening scene at the prison in Cayenne, he cut freely among several striking exterior compositions of officers calling the roll. The film also makes powerful use of off-screen sound. Much of the dreary atmosphere of Lisa's hotel room is conveyed by a sonic motif of trains passing. Other scenes avoid simple synchronization of sound and image. In a transition from Lisa's room to a factory where Berthier seeks work, the sound of a buzzsaw in the factory begins before the cut to the new location, creating an early example of a sound bridge. Later in the film, sound creates a flashback. As Berthier contemplates confessing to the killing, there is a cut from him to the prison in Cayenne and then back to him. Only then, as we see his thoughtful face again, do we hear his memory, the wardens telling him he is to be freed, a line spoken in the film's first scene. René Clair became the most widely known of early French sound directors, as Sous les toits de Paris, Under the Roofs of Paris, 1930, Les Millions 1930, and Anus, La Liberté. For Us, Liberty, 1931 found an international audience. His imaginative use of camera movements, stretches of silence, and sonic puns helped quiet the fears of critics who believed that sound would result in static dialogue pictures. We shall see his influence cropping up in national cinemas from Hollywood to China. Although a news, Lolly Berti uses dialogue, it also employs music extensively, something many filmmakers favored in the early sound period. Claire also liked to surprise his audience by using the wrong sound for an object. In one scene, Louis lounges in a field overlooking the factory. We hear music and singing, the sounds of nature itself, which Louis conducts. A close shot of a flower trembling in the wind is accompanied by a soprano voice so that it seems to be singing. France, Poetic Realism. How it all began. France felt the effects of the worldwide depression comparatively late. Bank failures began in late 1930, and economic production declined from the second half of 1931 on. The government failed to counter these problems, and the slump lingered throughout the 1930s. The film industry was hit hard by the depression, and its already unstable production sector became even more fragmented. Other studio systems we have examined, such as those of Britain, Japan, and Italy, were more coherent and prolific. Still, French cinema of this era was more significant than its industrial conditions would suggest, producing a surprising proportion of notable films. Filmmakers like René Clair and Jean Renoir did their most important work during the 1930s, and French films had an influence around the world second only to that of Hollywood films. A weak studio system offered filmmakers flexibility and freedom. Throughout Europe, economic problems created political turmoil. Italy, Germany, Spain, and smaller countries near France were establishing fascist governments. Right-wing parties were pushing France in the same direction, and during the mid-1930s a coalition of leftist groups, the Popular Front, opposed them and briefly came to power. This movement had a short-lived but significant impact on filmmaking. France's involvement in World War II, beginning in September 1939, cut off most filmmaking activity. When German forces captured Paris in June 1940, a right-wing French government was established in Vichy, in the south. The German occupation lasted until August 1944. During these 4 years, the conditions of film production and exhibition changed radically, and many filmmakers had to flee or go into hiding. Those who remained, however, managed to keep the French industry alive. Some of the resulting films are distinctive for their tone of fantasy, isolation, and escapism. Although World War II altered many countries' films, there can be few places where the break between the pre-war 1930s and the early wartime 1940s was as dramatic as in France. France's film production had declined precipitously from its glory days before World War I, when it dominated world screens. The coming of sound in 1929 gave it a boost, since audiences were eager to hear dialogue spoken in French, and prosperity early in the decade slightly bolstered production. The numbers of features made during the 1930s, however, show that by 1934 the French industry was eventually hit by the Depression, 1929, 52, 1930, 94, 1931:139, 1932:157, 1933:158, 1934:126, 1935:115, 1936:116, 1937:111, 1938:122, 1939:91. By contrast, the United States, Germany, and Japan were each producing hundreds of films each year. Even more than in the 1920s, much of the French production sector consisted of small firms. These were privately owned, unstable, and ephemeral. In some cases, filmmakers found themselves working for nothing after their employers absconded with the money. Other projects had to be halted when funds ran out. During the 1930s, 285 small firms made only one film apiece, and dozens more managed to produce only a few each. Even the largest producer, Pathé, made only 64 films throughout the decade, about as many as Paramount was producing annually. Production problems and artistic freedom. Size was no guarantee against corruption and mismanagement. Two of the largest firms, formed through mergers during the healthier period of the late 1920s, ran into trouble in the mid-1930s. Rather than cooperating to form an oligopoly, as the big firms in more stable studio systems did, the French companies tried to drive each other out of business. In 1934, Gaumont Franco-Film Aubert nearly went bankrupt, and only a government-sponsored loan saved it. Pathé ran into similar problems by 1936, complicated by the fact that one of its heads, Bernard Nathan, was discovered to have been embezzling funds. He went to jail, and the company had to be broken into smaller firms. The situation was not altogether gloomy, however. Government regulation and the coming of sound both helped loosen the American hold on the French market. In 1935, for the first time since World War I, French films made up over half of the domestic market. Moreover, film attendance, which had dropped early in the Depression, began to rise, and theater income increased. The decentralized structure of French film production helps explain why so many enduring films were made during this decade. Small companies lacked the elaborate production bureaucracy that characterized filmmaking in the United States, Germany, and the USSR. Instead, as in Japan, directors were often able to work on their own, supervising many phases of production. This situation, combined with a large number of talented actors, screenwriters, designers, cinematographers, composers, and other creative personnel, contributed to the creation of several distinctive trends. Many of the best remembered French films of the 1930s belong to a tendency that has been termed poetic realism. This was not a unified movement, like French Impressionism or Soviet montage. It was, rather, a general tendency. Poetic realism films often center on characters living on the margins of society, either as unemployed members of the working class or as criminals. After a life of disappointment, these shabby figures find a last chance at intense, ideal love. After a brief period they are disappointed again, and the films end with the disillusionment or deaths of the central characters. The overall tone is one of nostalgia and bitterness. Doomed lovers and atmospheric settings. There were some forerunners of poetic realism in the early 1930s. We have already examined Jean Gramillan's 1930 film La Petite Lisa, which provides a mature early example of this tendency. A convict returns from prison to find that his daughter has been forced into prostitution. When she accidentally helps kill a pawnbroker, he protects her by taking the blame for the crime. Another early example of the tendency is Fader's Pension Mimosas 1934. Its story centers on a woman who runs a boarding house and falls in love with her adopted son. Her elaborate attempts to thwart his falling in love with anyone else lead to his suicide. Aside from this tragic plot, The film depends on the precise establishment of atmosphere through the settings, the boarding house of the title, a local casino, and other sets, all designed by Lazare Meersen, who did the sets for Carnival in Flanders and other important films of the decade. Poetic realism blossomed in the mid-1930s, and its leading filmmakers were Julien Duvivier, Marcel Carné, and Jean Renoir. Duvivier's main contribution to the trend was Pepe I Moko 1936, a film that typifies poetic realism. Pepe is a gangster hiding out in the notorious Casbah section of Algiers, where the police dare not arrest him. Although he has a mistress already, he falls in love with a sophisticated Parisian, Gabi, who visits the district for a casual adventure. Their love is hopeless, since if he leaves the Casbah he will be caught. Duvivier captures a sense of Pepe's confinement in the Casbah district, despite the fact that most of the shots were made either in the studio or in the south of France. At the end of the film, Pepe ventures out in order to leave Algiers with Gabi. He is arrested at the dock and asks permission to watch her ship depart. As it pulls out to sea, he kills himself. Such a fatalistic ending is typical of poetic realist films. Pepe was played by Jean Gabin, one of the most popular actors of the period and the ideal trapped poetic realist hero. Handsome enough to play leads in light comedies and dramas, heavy-featured Gabin was also a plausible working-class protagonist. He starred in Marcel Carné's two major poetic realist films, Quai de Brum's Port of Shadows, 1938 and Les Jours et Lève Daybreak, 1939. In Quai de Brum's, Gabin plays Jean, a deserter from the French Foreign Legion who encounters a beautiful woman, Nelly played by Mick Morgan, who formed with Gabin the ideal couple of the period. They fall in love, but she is protected by a powerful gangster. Although Jean kills the gangster, he is himself gunned down by a member of the gang and dies in Nelly's arms. The dark, foggy cinematography of German Eugenski Ifton and the atmospheric sets by Alexander Trauner, with their rain-dampened brick streets, created a look that typified poetic realism. Les Jours Célèbres is another major example of poetic realism. Again, Gabin plays the protagonist, François, a worker who commits a murder in the first scene and is trapped in his apartment by police. Throughout the night he recalls the circumstances leading up to the present. We see them in 3 flashbacks showing how the villainous Valentine, the murder victim, had seduced the innocent young woman with whom François is in love. The simple story was not as important as the brooding atmosphere, created in part by Trauner's set. This studio-built version of a working-class district illustrates the mixture of stylization and realism in poetic realism. Maurice Joubert's music supplies a simple drum beat for the opening and closing scenes. Above all, Gabin's portrayal of François pensively awaiting his fate created the ultimate hero of poetic realism. Les Jours et Lève was released just 3 months before the German invasion of Poland. During the war, Carné would emphasize doomed romance and downplay realism in 2 of the most popular films of the era, Les Visiteurs du Soir and Children of Paradise. The creative burst of Jean Renoir. The most significant director of 1930s French cinema was Jean Renoir. Although his filmmaking career stretched from the 1920s to the 1960s, his output during this one decade was a remarkable case of concentrated creativity. He made a wide variety of films, some in the poetic realist strain. His first sound film, On Purge Bébé Roughly, Baby's Laxative, 1931, was a farce that Renoir made in order to get backing for other projects. His next film was completely different and can be seen as another forerunner of poetic realism. La Chienne the Bitch, 1931, concerns a mild accountant and amateur painter who is unhappily married, he stumbles into an affair with a prostitute whose pimp exploits the hero by selling his paintings. And there we have it. You have completed the topic. Thank you and see you all in the next teaching video for Film History MOOC.